In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 11, where last chapter we went over business cycle stability and the multiplier process. In this chapter, we will go over fiscal policy by considering policy, fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy, and contractionary fiscal policy. Where in today's discussion on policy, what we'll do is we will consider full employment as well as policy tools to then conclude with a summary. With all this in mind, beginning with full employment, in our discussion of business cycle stability, we concluded that in the short run, business cycles were not stable due to sticky prices. That is, the inability for prices or wages to respond to changes in the economy, which we can think about it due to agents in the economy being in contracts, where throughout the life of these contracts, the appropriate price points or wages will not be able to change until those contracts expire. Where, considering the case of a negative demand shock, should an economy be in a long-run equilibrium, experience a negative demand shock, after the cumulative effect has been realized, the economy will adjust to a short-run equilibrium in which there will be an unemployment gap. Where with this unemployment gap and this negative demand shock, this means that the economy would be above its natural rate of unemployment with a decrease in the inflation rate, where with respect to business cycles, this means that this economy contracted to a trough. Where, so long as agents in the economy are in their contracts, prices and wages will not be able to adjust such that the short-run equilibrium the economy adjusted to is where it will remain. However, given a sufficient amount of time, these contracts will expire and agents in the economy will be able to renegotiate, where with prices and wages now being able to respond to changes in the long run, this means that prices are now flexible, where with renegotiation due to flexible prices, this means firm costs will change, where firms will respond such that the economy will return to a long-run equilibrium in which it's back at potential real GDP and a further reduced price level, where in terms of the unemployment rate and inflation rate, this means the economy is back at its natural rate of unemployment with a further reduction in its inflation rate such that price stability still holds, and in terms of business cycles, this means that the economy recovered back to a long-run equilibrium. Now, in terms of this long-run self-adjustment, this is due to flexible prices, and this completes our narrative for business cycles. However, it is not the sole explanation, given that there can be a considerable amount of time for prices to go from sticky to flexible. Additionally, unemployment and inflation are problems at both the micro and macro level, such that waiting for the problem to resolve itself may not always be warranted, and we should be able to account for them immediately. Therefore, we should also be able to account for intervention in the economy in the short run. So this brings up the role of the government and how they can influence outcomes in the economy through policy, in which we'll be interested in how they can influence outcomes in the economy through aggregate demand. Where for the government to influence outcomes in an economy through policy, it would be the case that for a negative demand shock, if the economy was in a long-run equilibrium, experienced that negative demand shock after the cumulative effect has been realized and the economy is at its short-run equilibrium with an unemployment gap where they are above the natural rate of unemployment with a decreased inflation rate and they have contracted to a trough, where so long as prices are sticky, this is where the economy would remain. Well, given that full employment does not hold, the government would then want to step in and alter outcomes in the economy through aggregate demand by increasing aggregate demand, such that they would increase aggregate demand, and after that cumulative effect of this policy makes its way through the economy would adjust back to a long-run equilibrium, back to potential real GDP, and at the targeted price level, such that the economy returns back to its natural rate of unemployment and an inflation rate that's compatible with price stability, corresponding to this economy recovering back to a long-run equilibrium. Whereas with the case with the positive demand shock, should the economy be in a long-run equilibrium, experience a positive demand shock after the cumulative effect has been realized and there's adjustment to a short-run equilibrium with an inflationary gap, in which the economy is below its natural rate of unemployment and has an inflation rate that is above the price stability target of 3% or less. This means the economy has recovered to a peak where with full employment not holding and prices being sticky, the government may want to step in and restrain aggregate demand, where after the cumulative effect of the policy has been realized, the economy adjusts back to a long-run equilibrium, back at potential real GDP, and at a targeted price level, such that in terms of the unemployment rate and inflation rate, the economy is back at an inflation rate compatible with price stability and is at its natural rate of unemployment, where in terms of business cycles, this means that the economy contracted back to a long-run equilibrium. Now, for this to be possible, we need to see how the government can influence outcomes in the economy. So, since we're concerned with aggregate demand and how the government can influence it, let us recall our equations for the GDP decomposition, consumption function, and investment function, where what we'd like to do is to see the avenues in which the government can step in and influence. Where, starting with the GDP decomposition, we've seen that GDP is the sum of consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports, where immediately in the GDP decomposition, we have government expenditures, where the government will have control in terms of how much they're spending in the product markets of an economy, where should they increase or decrease the amount that they're spending, this will have an effect on aggregate demand, therefore affecting outcomes in the economy as a result. Now, moving on to the consumption function, consumption we have seen is equal to autonomous consumption plus income-dependent consumption, where focusing on autonomous consumption, we have seen that autonomous consumption is in part determined by taxes, where taxes are collections on income from the government, in that since it's collected from the government can influence, that is, increase or decrease the amount of taxes that they are collecting from consumer income, where should they change how much taxes they are collecting, this will alter consumption, which will mean this will alter aggregate demand, therefore altering outcomes in the economy. So taxes is also another avenue that the government can pursue. Lastly, we have the investment function, where using the inverse investment function, we have seen that interest rates are equal to autonomous investment minus interest-dependent investment, where with respect to the inverse investment function, we see that a possible way of influencing the economy would be through altering the interest rates, that is, the cost to borrow. If the government were able to alter the cost to borrow by increasing or decreasing it, this would have the effect of altering investment in the economy, therefore altering aggregate demand, therefore altering outcomes in the economy. So then, through looking at our equations and through some observations, we have seen that the avenues for the government to influence an economy through aggregate demand will be through government expenditures, that is how much they are spending in the product market of an economy, taxes in terms of how much they are collecting from consumer income, and interest rates, that is influencing the cost to borrow, therefore changing investment, therefore aggregate demand. Where in terms of these three avenues, we can differentiate them in terms of distinct tools, where these tools from the government will be fiscal policy and monetary policy, in which fiscal policy will be the use of spending and taxes by the government to alter outcomes in an economy, which means focusing on 1 and 2, that is government expenditures and taxes, whereas monetary policy will be the use of money and credit controls by the government to alter outcomes in an economy, which means item 3 in terms of interest rates. So then, now to conclude with our summary with all this in mind, long-run self-adjustment due to flexible prices completes our explanation of business cycles. However, it is not the only explanation in that the government can influence outcomes in an economy, given that in the short run, unemployment and inflation are problems in an economy, therefore being able to deal with them immediately may be a matter that the government will want to do. Where options that the government can pursue in terms of altering aggregate demand will include fiscal as well as monetary policy, where we will seek to develop both of these tools, where we will begin with fiscal policy and will be the subject of our next video.